JordsWoodShop is sponsored by Minimax and by I Would Like. Check out their products at iwouldlike.com. Welcome to another video for JordsWoodShop and I Would Like. In this video I'm going to be giving you an overview of the best practices and techniques to use for milling your own timber using a jointer and thicknesser. Now this video is aimed at those who haven't got all that much experience in the world of milling yet, so I do have to warn you, there will be a lot of talking, and if that's not your style, well, you have been warned. Now there's several things we need to consider before using these machines, in fact any machine, and that is your personal safety. Now on a jointer like this, you have a very fast spinning cutter block, which while it's covered, you could still potentially get into a bit of trouble. So if you're wearing loose clothing, that is actually possible to get sucked into that cutter head and drag you with it. So make sure your clothing is nice and fitting. If you've got a button-up shirt or something, make sure all the buttons are done. Long sleeves, make sure they're done up at the cuff or even better, rolled up. And also things like jewelry and long hair. So if you've got long hair, tie it up because you do not want to have your hair fall into the cutter head. If you've got jewelry like a necklace or a bracelet that's a bit dangly, take it off. It's not worth risking it. While it's unlikely, it could happen, so just take it off. On top of things like that, these machines can be loud, so make sure you have ear protection and eye protection. So you don't want any dust getting in your eyes and you don't want any chips, because trust me, it's happened to me and it really does hurt getting it removed. Now on top of your personal safety, you have to inspect the machine to be safe. So if you've got cutter guards, make sure they're installed and in place. So here you can see I've got my knife guard in place. And also inspect the machine and make sure you're familiar with how to switch it on and off, so know where the switches are. And if there's an emergency stop, make sure you know where that is as well. Now the last thing that is, in my mind, very important on a jointer is push block. So I never want to use my hands on a machine like this because it takes one slip and your hand could go into a cutter block, and while the new cutter blocks are pretty good, you're still very likely to lose a fair bit of skin, if not a knuckle. So push blocks are an essential piece of safety equipment for a jointer in my mind. Now there are several things to consider with your workpiece as well. So grain direction, which way is your grain running and which way should you feed it through the machine to prevent tearing and chipping. You've also got things like cupping and bowing. So if you've got a cupped board, which face should you put down and which face should you put up to safely accommodate that. Things like components which are coming from those boards are also important to consider as well. So say that you've got a nice wide board, but you've got 4 legs coming out of it. It's a good idea to actually cut that down to rough size ahead of time, and then grain direction is something that confuses a lot of people, and it's really not all that hard to figure out. Now, it is confusing at times, especially on darker boards, because it is very hard to see the grain. But let's have a look at this workpiece here, which is nice and clear, and I've traced all of the grain for you so you can see it easily. So what we have here is a board with a nice cathedral pattern, so we can see all of these points coming through in the grain. Now, which way is this grain actually running? Well, look at the points, and whichever way these points in the cathedral pattern are running is our grain direction. So we're going this way, so from this end all the way up to here. So there is our grain direction. Now, there is one thing that is quite confusing about all of this, and that is grain direction versus feed direction. So at the jointer, we actually want to feed it the other way around because our cutter block is spinning and cutting against the direction of feed. So our cut direction is that way, but our feed direction is that way. And that can get a bit confusing, but all you have to consider is that you're cutting and you want all of those fibers to be supported. So our knives will be going this way, and our board will be going that way. So we're going like this. Now that's when it's nice and easy, but what about these boards here which are really dark? Well, sometimes you cannot actually see the grain direction, and you'll have to look at the side of the board and see if you can see any grain direction. And if all else fails, just take it for one pass, a light pass in the jointer, and if you start getting chip out, you know you should probably flip that board around. So it's a little bit difficult on these darker boards, but take it easy, do one pass, and if you're getting good results, you've probably won. And if not, flip it around and see if you get anything better. Now, besides the grain direction, there's another few things that you should consider with your workpiece. So if there is cupping on your board, and by cupping I mean that the board has a bit of a frown to it, you would probably want to make sure that that face, so the downward frown, not the smile, but the frown is facing down, so that you've got 2 points of contact on your table. It will give you a much more stable board, and there'll be less chance of rocking. The same goes with a bow. So if you've got a bow along the length of your board, I would make sure that the bow is making a sad face so that you've got the two ends making contact and your middle is the high point. Now, you will get a thin board towards the ends, but it's a safer procedure because you've got less chance of the board rocking. Now, I haven't really spoken about twisted boards, and that's because last year I did this video called Saving Twisted and Warped Boards, showing you a really good method to use to actually save boards which have got a severe amount of twist. Now, if you're not a huge fan of that method, or you've only got a board that's slightly twisted, you can probably go straight over to the jointer, but there is one thing you can do to make life a bit easier, and that is just remove the high corners. So we've got a high corner here, and I just knocked that down using a hand plane, and just by removing those little corners, I've made this board sit a lot nicer on the bench. So twisted boards can be a bit of a nightmare, but if you just take your time and make sure that you get it sitting fairly nicely on your workbench, they are generally not too much of an issue. Now, determining grain direction and which way you should feed the board and which face should be down is all something that will eventually become second nature to you, and you won't even need to think about when you come to your jointer. But as a new woodworker or new to at least milling your own timber at your machines, it can be a bit of a daunting task. So just take your time, have a look at the board, and you should be fine. And eventually you won't even think about it, and you'll come in and you'll be making flat boards left, right, and center. So now that we know how to determine grain direction, we know which faces should go down, let's actually get this board here to be S4S, which is square 4 sides, and that means 2 flat and parallel faces with 2 square edges, which are also nice and parallel. Here I'm using my Minimax FS30 Classic, which is a beautiful machine, but it may be a little bit different to what you're used to seeing, as it's a combination machine, so both jointer and thicknesser in one, which uses a European style of blade guard. Now, no matter what setup you're using in your workshop, the concept's going to be the same, it just may be a little bit different in setup. Now, I mentioned earlier about blade guards and making sure everything is in place. Now, this machine uses this style of cutter guard, which is something that covers the blade for the entire operation, at least for face joining. So it covers the blade and you'll feed your board under the blade guard. Now, what most of you have probably got as it's more common is the US style, or I believe it's called the US style, which is a swing away blade guard. So what you'll do is you would push your workpiece through the machine and the blade guard swings out of the way. So whatever it is, just make sure it's in place and set up correctly. So for this style of guard, I like to make it so it's about 5mm above the thickness of the workpiece. So as I feed it through, if I did slip, I'm not going to be able to fall under the blade guard. I'll just have to kind of push it down instead. So the first thing we're going to do is get one face to be flat, and we see here we've got our grain direction here, so the grain's running towards the back of the machine, and that's the way we want it. So our cutter head will be cutting with the grain. Now, as far as where to put your hand pressure and which side, so which table to do it on, I use a rough rule, and this is very rough, and that is 60-40. So whatever table has 60% of the board on it is the board that is the side, I should say, that gets your downward pressure. So here, all the pressure would be on the outfeed or the infeed table. And once we hit about halfway or just over, we'll switch our pressure to the outfeed table, continue passing our board through. And that will ensure that we have one good referencing face the entire cut. Depending on how bad your board is, so how out of flat it is, will determine on how many times you need to send it over the cutter block. But generally it'll take several passes before you're left with a completely flat board, and that is especially true if you're taking a nice light cut at your jointer. Now personally, I don't like to take much more than 1mm as a maximum, because I find that gives you a nice result and it's not too hard on the knives as well. Okay, so with one face now nice and flat, we want one flat and square edge to the board. So make sure that you check your fence is nice and square with a good quality square here, and if it is, you're good to go. Now with this European style of blade guard, we actually, for edge jointing, we'll actually slide it out of the way and leave that part of the blade exposed. And that way, when we're jointing it, we just don't have to take our hands off it at all. And obviously we don't want our guard to be up this high because there's no point in having a blade guard then. So we'll set it so we've got a bit of a gap there and we'll get on our way. As far as where to put your hand pressure, it's pretty much the same deal, although we now have one extra thing to consider, and that is applying a bit of sideways pressure to keep it nice and flat against the fence. Now, as far as the downward pressure, same thing. So we keep downward pressure on whichever side of the machine has the most amount of workpiece on it, so that 60-40 rule. And then for the sideways pressure, this is where a lot of people go wrong. So people that get a joiner for the first time think they need to try and push the machine over with all their body weight just to keep the workpiece nice and square. Now, that is actually the wrong thing to do. Now, you want to put as a little pressure on the side there as possible, because if you do put too much, you're going to distort the fence and you're not going to get very good results. Plus, it's a lot of extra strain on yourself, and if something does go wrong, you're more likely to fall into the machine than being able to step away. So with that set, let's get this one edge nice and square. So just like with the face jointing, you can see that it took several passes, but now we're left with this nice flat square edge, and it's really nice and square. So if you have a look here, you can see it's perfectly square. So now that we have this board here, which has one flat face and one square edge, which is S2S, which is square on two sides, we want to change the machine over into thicknessing mode and bring the opposite face and edge to be flat and parallel to that. Now, I know some of you are going to be asking, why not just flip the board over again and joint the other face in the same manner? Well, that would definitely give us a flat and straight edge, a face I should say, but it will not give us a parallel face. So what we could end up having is a board which is wedge shaped, and that is pretty much useless for most furniture applications. So with a thicknesser, the table and cutter head is perfectly parallel to one another and it's fixed like that. So we're guaranteed a nice flat parallel board which is perfectly square and plumb and all of those sorts of things. So all the same rules really apply for thicknessing as it does for jointing. So we've got our grain direction and we're going to be cutting with the grain. So we'll have the actual grain direction pointing away from the machine. So we'll be going in like so. And the amount of material we want to remove is about the same as well. So no more than 1 millimeter at a time is a pretty good sort of rule of thumb, I guess you could say. So here, we'll fire it up, we'll take one light pass, and we should be good to go. So now what we have is a board which has two flat and perfectly parallel faces with one square and flat edge. Now to bring it to be the final thing, which is S4S, square on all four sides, we need to bring this other edge to be perfectly square and parallel to this edge. Now to do that, my favorite method on boards like this, which are quite wide and very narrow or skinny, is to actually send it through your table saw and rip it to its final width. And that, for me, is the safest and best method. However, in this workshop, I don't have a table saw anymore, so I would generally use my bandsaw to cut it pretty closely and then bring it to line using a hand plane. Now, on boards which aren't quite as wide as these or a little bit thicker, there's nothing wrong in my mind with sending it through the thicknesser on edge, as long as it's stable enough when it's up like that, because you really don't want this thing falling over. So for me, anything that's over about 1.5 inches in thickness, or 30 millimeters roughly, is perfectly fine to do that. And as long as it's not too tall, I don't have a problem in doing so. That said, preferred method is still going to be the table saw, because to me it is a lot safer. Okay, so that was a lot of talking, but hopefully that has cleared up a bit of the mystery behind milling your own timber using your jointer and thicknesser. So a big thanks to the guys over at iwouldlike.com for bringing this video to you guys, and a huge thanks to you guys for watching, liking it and subscribing, clicking that thumbs up button and commenting and all of that sort of stuff. So a huge thanks to you guys. It really does mean a lot to me. So like always, if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button down there, because we are putting out new woodworking videos pretty much every week. So if you don't want to miss out on any of those, make sure you click that subscribe button. On top of that, if you've enjoyed this video, please do click the like button or the thumbs up button and leave a comment below, and also share it around if you know anyone that might be interested. So like always, thanks for watching. A huge thanks to the guys over at I Would Like again, so head over to their website and check their stuff out, and I'll see you in the next video.